A powerful millionaire insulted his loyal nanny for her skin and status, but karma had other plans. Hello, dear viewers. I'm Alcot Brian, and I'm so thrilled to have you join me here today. Whether you've been with us for a while or are a new member of our community, I want to extend the warmest welcome to you all. Here at Alcot Stories, we believe in the power of storytelling to heal, inspire, and bring us together. As we gather together through these stories, I want to take a moment to say a loving prayer for you all. May your hearts be filled with peace, your spirits be lifted with hope, and your minds be open to the beauty and lessons that each story brings. May you find comfort in the words and strength in the journeys we share. May love surround you, and may joy light your path. Amen. To all of you joining for the first time, I'd like to kindly ask you to hit that subscribe button. Join our growing family, where we share not just stories, but experiences that touch the heart. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the magic we create together. Once again, thank you for being here. I'm honored to be your storyteller. Let's dive into this journey together. Stay tuned for more amazing tales, and always remember, your story matters too. Edward Blackwell was a man built from the cold, unyielding foundations of ambition. His empire, Blackwell Enterprises, was a colossal force in the tech world, stretching its fingers into every major innovation, with no compassion for anything or anyone. His face, always set in a sharp, calculating expression, looked as though it was carved from stone, smooth but incapable of showing warmth or mercy. His heart, a vault sealed shut, locked by the accumulation of years spent clawing his way to power, with no regard for the toll left behind. The man had no use for empathy, no tolerance for weakness, and in his eyes, people were either tools or obstacles, nothing more. His staff, his colleagues, and even his children learned long ago not to expect anything resembling tenderness from him. His wife had known that too, though she had tried to bring some light into their dark mansion, tried to soften the cold corners of his world with love. But even her warmth couldn't survive his ice. When his wife, Eleanor, tragically passed away in a car accident, Edward didn't crumble. He didn't even mourn, at least not in any public way. He buried his grief deep under layers of icy indifference, as though her absence was simply another inconvenience. His children, Sophie and Caleb, were now a burden he had no patience for. They were reminders of a life he'd rather forget, their mother's memory haunting his every move. The only thing left for him to do was to hire someone to take care of them, a nanny, someone who could blend into the background and tend to the children as he focused on building his empire. Marla Jenkins, a black woman with a degree in education and a soft but resilient spirit, found herself walking through the front door of the Blackwell estate at precisely 9 a.m. on a chilly autumn morning. She was to be the new nanny for the Blackwell children. She had done her research on Edward Blackwell, his towering success, his ruthless reputation, his lack of tolerance for anything less than excellence. She wasn't intimidated, not by his money or his power, but she did wonder what kind of man would build an empire on the backs of so many, a man who had earned his wealth through cold ambition and ruthless tactics. But for her, it wasn't about him. It was about the children, Sophie and Caleb, who had lost their mother and deserved some semblance of warmth and care in their lives. She was determined to be their rock, their steady hand in the midst of their father's storm. Edward Blackwell, in contrast, saw her as nothing more than a necessary inconvenience, just another cog in the machine. He didn't care that she was qualified. He didn't care that she was kind, intelligent, or deeply committed to helping the children. What mattered to him was that she was black. And that fact irked him. It didn't fit the image of perfection he had carefully cultivated, the immaculate facade he put forth to the world. She didn't belong in his pristine home, with its polished floors, sleek furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling estate. In his mind, she was beneath him, a reminder of a world he wanted nothing to do with. He treated her with the coldest form of indifference, never rude enough to be overtly offensive, but always distant and dismissive. He addressed her in clipped sentences, never meeting her gaze for long. He gave her instructions, never asking her opinion, and never once acknowledging her value. And when the staff and guests came around, he made sure to speak about her as though she were just another part of the furniture. Necessary, but not important. "The nanny will take care of that," he would say in front of his colleagues, his tone cold, almost dismissive, as though she weren't a human being with a name, but simply a figure to manage his children. He never smiled at her, never offered any sign of gratitude. There were no pleasantries at all. Marla, for her part, took the abuse in stride. She didn't let his coldness freeze her. She had seen far worse in her years of teaching and tutoring. She had been subjected to racism in ways more blatant than Edward's subtle, insidious form. She refused to let it dictate her actions, especially not when it came to the children. Sophie and Caleb were starved for affection, their eyes hollow with the loss of their mother, and it broke her heart to see them under the care of such a distant man. But she was there for them, no matter how cold or dismissive Edward became. At first, Sophie was reluctant to get close to Marla. She was wary of anyone who might try to replace her mother. But as Marla quietly and patiently guided her through her day, playing games, reading books, helping with her homework, Sophie's resistance slowly began to thaw. Caleb, only 6, immediately clung to her like a lifeline, looking to her with the same innocent trust he had once given his mother. The bond between them grew quickly, and the Blackwell mansion, cold and unwelcoming as it was, began to feel a little warmer with each passing day. Marla's laughter, her gentle voice, and her kindness were the only light in the house. But Edward never noticed. To him, it didn't matter. He wasn't interested in the softening of his children. He wasn't interested in Marla's devotion or the slow healing of his son and daughter's broken hearts. As long as the children stayed out of his way and didn't inconvenience him, that was enough. He treated them both as tools for his legacy. His children were his future, his business partners in the making. His eyes never softened when he looked at them, never showed any sign of affection. He viewed his children much the same way he viewed everything in his life, as a means to an end. But still, Marla remained, undeterred by the chill that clung to the air. Every day she showed up for Sophie and Caleb, always warm, always present, and though Edward would never acknowledge her efforts, she continued to give her best. She knew that even if he never thanked her, the children felt the love she poured into them, and that, in the end, was what mattered most. Yet in the deepest parts of her heart, Marla knew this situation couldn't last. She knew that the walls Edward had built around his heart were too high, too impenetrable. But for now, she could only focus on what was in front of her. The children, and she would fight for them. fight for their emotional well-being, even if she had to do it alone. As for Edward Blackwell, his world remained untouched by any real human connection. He walked through his days in a haze of business meetings, stock market fluctuations, and mindless decisions. His life, meticulously structured and controlled, had no room for emotions, for empathy. His mansion, a palace of glass and steel, reflected the emptiness inside him. A man who could command the world, but who couldn't reach the hearts of those closest to him. And for now, that was all he knew. As the days stretched into weeks, Edward's cold, indifferent nature showed no signs of changing. But for Marla, the atmosphere within the Blackwell mansion was slowly beginning to shift. Though Edward remained as impervious to emotions as ever, something about his children made her fight through the emotional walls she built around herself. Sophie, at first wary and distant, gradually warmed up to her in a way that surprised them both. There was a quiet grace about Sophie. Her sharp intellect and her carefully controlled emotions made her seem older than her years, and at times Marla found herself in awe of how the young girl seemed to understand the pain she was going through. Sophie missed her mother terribly, and while Marla could never replace the woman who had brought Sophie into the world, she knew she could offer something equally important: stability. Marla would read to Sophie at night, books that spanned from fairy tales to real stories of strong women in history. Sometimes they would sit in the sunroom, Marla brushing Sophie's hair as they talked about anything and everything, and slowly, very slowly, Sophie began to let herself feel again, starting with a simple gesture: a smile. Caleb, on the other hand, clung to Marla from the moment she entered the house, finding comfort in her presence like a lighthouse in a storm. The little boy had never known a world without pain. He had been too young when his mother passed. Every day he would run to her with wide eyes and wrap his arms around her legs, whispering secrets only she could understand. Marla felt a quiet tenderness for Caleb, sensing that he had a fragile soul, one that needed nurturing, gentleness, and love. In the warmth of their daily exchanges, she could feel him healing in ways that words couldn't express. Edward, however, watched from the sidelines, detached and unaffected by the warmth that was beginning to grow in his home. He made no effort to acknowledge the change in his children, and worse yet, he seemed uninterested in what was happening between Marla and the kids. He would come home late after long days of business, his face rigid, his thoughts consumed by numbers and meetings. Sometimes he would glance at Marla, but his eyes held no sign of appreciation, only cold assessment. It was as if he saw her not as a person, but as a piece of furniture, a necessary part of the household. Marla could feel the sting of his indifference, but she refused to let it consume her. She was here for Sophie and Caleb, and nothing would take her focus away from them. Despite her growing attachment to the children, she had to remain vigilant. She knew that Edward's expectations, or lack thereof, could be unpredictable. She refused to let him control her emotions. Still, her heart ached for the children. She could see how deeply they yearned for affection, for a connection they would never receive from their father. They had learned long ago not to expect warmth from him, and though they were still young, there were glimpses in their eyes that spoke volumes. Sophie's intelligence and Caleb's open-hearted nature spoke to a depth of emotional awareness that far surpassed Edward's ability to understand. They were like uncut diamonds, full of potential. But they needed someone to guide them through the rough patches, to teach them that love was not a commodity to be used and discarded. Marla's love for them was the one constant she could give them, and she offered it without hesitation. She had learned long ago how to love unconditionally, even in the face of prejudice, pain, and hardship. It was her life's work, first as an educator and now as a caregiver. And though she was faced with a man who was beyond difficult, a man who thought his money and power were all that mattered, she continued to pour her heart into the children, hoping that one day they would look back and know she had been the one to give them the love they so desperately needed. But as the weeks passed, Edward's demeanor toward her grew colder, if that was even possible. He would enter rooms with a stiff, businesslike air, his eyes darting over Marla as though she were simply an accessory. She had learned not to expect kindness, but the constant dismissal was beginning to wear on her. There were moments when she would overhear his conversations with colleagues, his voice dripping with condescension as he would refer to her as the Nanny. The word nanny stung more than she could express, as if he was reminding her of her place, of her position at the bottom of the social ladder. He never referred to her by her name. It was always the nanny. It was the same way he spoke about his staff, distant, detached, as though they were all replaceable parts. But there was something in Marla that refused to break. She would take the harsh words and let them roll off her back like water off a duck's feathers. She wasn't here for him. She was here for Sophie and Caleb, and that was all that mattered. But there was something else, a quiet yearning deep within her. Every day she saw more of the emotional gaps that Edward had left us in his children's lives. He was a man incapable of love, or at least he had buried it so deep inside of him that it had become a relic, a memory of a time he no longer wanted to acknowledge. As she sat with the children, helping them with their homework, reading them stories, or simply offering comfort during quiet moments, she began to question whether Edward would ever see them as anything more than extensions of his business empire. Sophie was smart, sharp, and intuitive, always reading books far beyond her age, and Caleb, for all his sweetness, was so emotionally raw that it hurt to witness. Marla knew these children needed something Edward could never give them. A mother's love, a sense of security, and emotional depth. Edward had money, power, and influence, but he lacked the one thing his children needed most, someone who would put them first, without an agenda. Marla knew that she could be that person. In the quiet moments when the children were asleep, when the mansion was still and empty, Marla would sometimes find herself standing by the window, staring out at the vast estate that Edward had built. She would think about her own life, her own family, her own struggles, and wonder what it would take to finally break through the walls that Edward had erected around himself. She wondered if there was a part of him that longed for connection, for love, for something deeper than the hollow life he had built. It was a question she could never ask him directly. Edward Blackwell was not a man who welcomed vulnerability. But in those rare moments when the house was silent and the weight of everything hung heavy in the air, she would entertain the idea that, perhaps, just perhaps, even someone like Edward Blackwell might one day change. The tension that had built within the Blackwell mansion had reached a boiling point, though it was one that no one dared to speak of aloud. Marla, for all her inner strength, could feel the growing fracture between herself and Edward. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the way he avoided her, the way his eyes flicked past her when she addressed him, as if she were no more significant than the furniture in the room. But she wasn't foolish. She knew what it meant. Edward's indifference was no longer passive. It was deliberate. His silence, his coldness, these were weapons, wielded with careful precision to remind her of her place. She had no delusions about this man. He was someone who understood power not as a means to an end, but as an unquestionable authority that could crush anything in its path. Even her, even the children. The children. Marla's heart ached for Sophie and Caleb every day. They were the reason she put up with Edward's constant emotional neglect. Sophie, once so closed off, had begun to open up, but it was never without a shadow of sadness hanging behind her bright, observant eyes. Caleb, though still young, had developed a quiet strength that could have broken a man in the right circumstances. But it wasn't enough to save him from the emotional abyss created by his father's indifference. As Marla continued to care for them, as her love for them grew with each passing day, she could feel a storm brewing between herself and Edward, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it would erupt. The tension reached its peak one cold evening at an extravagant charity gala hosted by Edward. The event, one of the most talked about in the city, was a spectacle of wealth and power, with important guests from every corner of society. Edward, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, stood at the center of the room, a man who thrived on being the star of every gathering. He was a force of nature in this world, a god of commerce and society. And as was customary, his children were by his side, part of his meticulously crafted image, though neither seemed particularly at ease in the spotlight. Sophie, in her fine dress, stood stiffly beside him, her face expressionless, while Caleb clung to Marla's side, clearly overwhelmed by the noise and the people. Marla had always avoided the social events that Edward attended. She wasn't a part of that world. She knew it. She didn't belong in those circles. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she felt compelled to attend. Perhaps it was her desire to show Sophie and Caleb that she could protect them, even in the suffocating world of Edward's social elite. Or perhaps it was the need to assert some kind of power, just for herself. She had learned over the past few months that if she could navigate this world, if she could find a way to give the children a sense of safety in the middle of all this glittering emptiness, then perhaps she could build a bridge to the part of Edward that she had yet to understand, the part that was human, the part that could love. But the night began to spiral out of control as soon as Edward saw Sophie whisper something to Marla in the corner of the room. It was a brief exchange, nothing worth noting. But in Edward's eyes, it was an insurrection. Sophie, in her youthful innocence, had dared to seek comfort from Marla in front of their guests. Edward's jaw clenched, his nostrils flared as he watched the small act of rebellion play out in front of him. Sophie had broken one of his unspoken rules, the rule that his children were not to be emotionally dependent on anyone outside of him, and certainly not a black woman in his house. To him, this was not just an inconvenience, it was an affront, a challenge to his authority, and he would not stand for it. With a calculated step, Edward strode over to where Marla and Sophie stood, his presence like a cold wind sweeping through the room. "Sophie," he said, his voice sharp as glass, "we don't have time for this nonsense. Go and mingle with the other guests. You're embarrassing yourself." His eyes briefly flicked to Marla, dismissing her presence entirely. Sophie's face fell, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. But she did as her father commanded, walking away with her head low, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The moment she was out of earshot, Edward turned his full wrath onto Marla, his gaze cold and venomous. "This is not your place," he spat, the words cutting through the air like a whip. "You are here to take care of the children, nothing more. Keep your distance. You have no right to interfere with how I raise them." His tone, though low, was laced with contempt that made Marla's blood run cold. Every eye in the room had turned toward them, and in that instant Marla felt the weight of their judgment. She could hear the quiet whispers, the subtle gasps from the guests. She was nothing more than the hired help in their eyes, and Edward had just reinforced that belief with one chilling sentence. His disdain was as palpable as the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could utter a word, Edward raised his hand to silence her, his gaze unwavering. "You think you can change anything? That you can make a difference in their lives?" he sneered. "They're mine, Marla. And you?" He paused, his eyes glinting with something dark. "You're nothing but a servant, a nanny. Nothing more." The words struck her harder than she had expected. She knew what he thought of her, but to hear him say it so openly, so viciously, in front of so many people, was more than a humiliation. It was a declaration that her place in his world was defined, and it was below him. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the anger and humiliation mixing into a raw, burning feeling. She was tempted to lash out, to expose him for the man he truly was. But she couldn't. Not here. Not in front of these people. So instead, she simply stood there, her face a mask of stoicism, and nodded. Edward, seeing the hurt in her eyes, seemed to take pleasure in it. He gave her a final dismissive glance before turning back to his guests, as if she had never existed. Marla remained in the same spot for a long moment, her hands trembling at her sides. The room felt suffocating, as if the air itself had been sucked from her lungs. She wanted to leave, wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not while Sophie and Caleb needed her. It was then that she heard a small voice at her side. "Are you okay, Marla?" It was Caleb, standing by her, his small face full of concern. The innocence in his eyes brought her back from the brink. She knelt down beside him, her arms enveloping him in a tight hug. "I'm fine, Caleb," she whispered, her voice breaking for the briefest second. But as she held him, as the world continued to swirl around her, she realized something. Edward had underestimated her. He had underestimated how far she would go to protect his children. He had underestimated her strength, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she could survive him, that she could find a way to not just endure the pain he caused, but to overcome it. That night, when the party finally ended and the guests trickled out of the mansion, Marla didn't sleep. She spent hours staring out of the window, her mind reeling. She knew what she had to do. She would stand up for Sophie and Caleb, no matter the cost. If Edward thought he could break her, he was wrong. She would not let him. She would not let him destroy what little light remained in this house, and she would never let him turn her into the villain. The battle had just begun. The days that followed the gala were a blur for Marla. She had hoped that the sting of Edward's public humiliation would fade, that the weight of the evening's events would eventually settle. But it didn't. Instead, it lingered like a heavy fog in the corners of her mind. Every time she saw Edward, his coldness felt more palpable, his presence more suffocating. The mansion, once a place of relative calm, now felt like a battleground. Edward's harsh words echoed in her thoughts, the insults cutting through her resolve like sharp knives. He had made it clear where he saw her place in the world. Beneath him. Beneath everyone in his circle. It stung, more than she cared to admit, but something inside her had shifted. She could no longer pretend that the life she had built for herself was sustainable under his oppressive gaze. The mansion had always been a gilded cage, but now it felt like a prison. Her duty to the children, Sophie and Caleb, was still her anchor, but she had come to realize something far more unsettling. She couldn't continue to ignore the weight of Edward's disdain. Not if she was going to preserve her own sense of self. The cracks in her heart widened as she noticed Sophie pulling away from her in small but undeniable ways. It was subtle. At first, just a shift in Sophie's posture when Marla would sit beside her. A slight distancing when they spoke. Marla had always been able to see into Sophie's heart. She knew that the girl was holding something back. Sophie, who had once found solace in Marla's presence, was now retreating into herself, following the same path Edward had carved for her. Cold, distant, and emotionally closed off. Marla couldn't blame her. Sophie was just a reflection of the environment she was growing up in. An environment where emotional vulnerability was considered weakness, and feelings were either ignored or punished. The more Marla tried to reach out to Sophie, the further the girl seemed to retreat, almost as if she were afraid of the bond they had formed. Caleb, too, seemed to sense the change in the air, though his reaction was different. The little boy, ever so sensitive, had started clinging to Marla with an intensity that was almost suffocating at times. He would follow her around the house, his small hands grabbing at the hem of her skirt, his wide eyes filled with unspoken questions. He didn't understand why his sister was pulling away, but he could feel it. He could sense the emotional void growing between them all. He was too young to articulate it, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. And Marla, in her quiet way, began to understand that it wasn't just Edward's cruelty that was tearing them apart. It was the fact that no one in this house, least of all Edward, knew how to love properly. Edward had always been emotionally distant, but his cruelty was becoming more deliberate. He seemed to take pleasure in putting Marla in her place, making sure she knew just how much she didn't belong. The moments when he would deliberately ignore her presence, the times when he would make snide comments about her background, her race, or her place in his life. These moments were no longer sporadic. They were becoming routine. And each time, Marla swallowed her pride, choosing to maintain a semblance of professionalism and dignity for the sake of the children. But it was starting to take its toll. One particularly exhausting evening, as Marla was helping Sophie with her homework in the study, she heard the familiar sound of Edward's footsteps approaching. Her heart sank. She had been bracing herself for one of his condescending remarks, and sure enough, he appeared in the doorway, his expression as cold as ever. "Sophie," he said, his voice clipped, "I need you to come with me. There are important people here who want to meet you." Sophie looked up at her father, her face a mask of reluctance, but she stood up without a word, following Edward out of the room like a well-trained puppet. The brief glance Sophie gave Marla before leaving was enough to pierce her heart. It was the look of someone who had given up on finding comfort, someone who had learned to bury their feelings deep within themselves. Marla felt a pang of helplessness, but she pushed it aside as she turned her attention back to Caleb, who was sitting on the floor with a toy in his hands. His eyes were wide, a mirror to the innocence he still held, despite the growing tension in the house. "It's okay, baby," Marla whispered, brushing his hair back. "They'll be back soon." But even as she reassured him, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were unraveling in a way that couldn't be undone. That night, as Edward entertained guests in the grand dining room, Marla found herself alone with the children. Sophie had retreated to her room, her door shut tight against the world, and Caleb had long since fallen asleep in her arms. As she gently placed him in his bed, she stood over him, watching the rise and fall of his small chest. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in this house. But her heart was breaking. The weight of the responsibility she had taken on was heavier than she could bear at times. And now, more than ever, it felt like she was losing her battle against the indifference that surrounded her. In the quiet of the night, after the guests had left and the mansion had returned to its oppressive silence, Marla found herself standing at the window once again, gazing out into the darkness. She had always found a strange sense of solace in the night, the way everything was still, how it allowed her to process her thoughts without interruption. But tonight, the stillness felt suffocating, as if the silence was a reflection of the emptiness inside her. She wondered, for the first time, if she had been foolish to believe that she could make a difference. She had come here with a mission, to protect the children, to be the kind of maternal figure they so desperately needed. But as the days wore on, she began to realize just how far gone Edward was. He was a man too consumed by his own power, his own hatred, to see the damage he was doing to the very people he claimed to love. Marla was starting to understand that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much love she poured into this house, there would always be a wall between her and Edward, one that was built on years of hate and bitterness. And yet, even as the weight of it all threatened to drown her, she knew one thing for sure. She could never give up on Sophie and Caleb. They deserved better. They deserved more than a cold, calculating father who only cared about his own image. She would fight for them, no matter what it took. It wasn't just about being a nanny anymore. It was about being their protector, their advocate. She had already sacrificed so much to get to this point. She had given up her own dreams, her own stability, to be here for them. And she wasn't about to let Edward Blackwell strip away the love she had built in this home. In the quiet of the night, Marla made a vow to herself. She would stand up to Edward. She would not let him destroy what little was left of the warmth in his children's lives. And no matter how hard it would be, she would make sure they knew that love, real love, still existed, even if it had to come from someone who had been cast aside by society. She wasn't just the nanny anymore. She was a mother, a protector, and she would not let anyone, especially Edward, take that away from her. The days that followed Marla's vow to herself were an unspoken declaration of war against the icy walls Edward had built around himself. As much as she had sworn to protect the children, something had shifted within her, a quiet, growing defiance against the coldness that Edward carried like a badge of honor. She realized that in order to shield Sophie and Caleb from their father's indifference, she first had to confront the root of it all, Edward himself. But she wasn't sure how she could do it. Edward was a man built on control, and his power was rooted in his belief that he could dictate the lives of everyone around him. He had constructed his life like a fortress, brick by brick, and Marla felt more than ever like a mere intruder within it. And yet, she knew she couldn't let that stop her. She began with small, strategic acts of resistance. She spoke to Sophie more, trying to break through the wall that Edward had erected between her and the world. Sophie, in her grief and confusion, was so afraid of showing emotion, afraid that to feel was to show to weakness. Every time she reached out to her, Marla could see the hesitation in Sophie's eyes, a reluctance to trust. And yet, there were moments when Sophie would soften, just for a second, and Marla would hold on to those moments like lifelines, knowing that no matter how small, they meant something. They were a sign that Sophie hadn't completely closed herself off to the possibility of love, even in a house so devoid of it. Caleb, on the other hand, was still clinging to her for support, following her every step with an intensity that at times felt overwhelming. He was still too young to fully grasp the weight of his father's actions, but his innocence made him even more vulnerable to the emotional turmoil around him. His small hands would often grasp at her skirt as she moved through the house, and when he'd look up at her with those big brown eyes, she could see the trust he placed in her. It broke her heart that he had to grow up in this atmosphere, that the house he lived in, with its opulent rooms and polished floors, could not offer him the safety he needed. Instead, it was a battleground, a place where emotions were suppressed and every word was a weapon. But Marla swore to herself that Caleb would know love. He would know affection, warmth and protection, and she would be the one to give it to him. One evening, as the autumn winds whipped outside, bringing the crisp chill of the coming winter with them, Marla stood in the kitchen, preparing a warm meal for the children. She had learned over time that the act of cooking, the simple rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, calmed her frazzled nerves. It gave her a moment of peace in a world that was often chaotic. But as she worked, she could feel Edward's presence in the doorway before she even turned to look. His voice, as always, was sharp when he spoke, as if he expected her to flinch at the sound of it. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. Marla didn't respond immediately. She simply continued to stir the pot, focusing on the warmth of the kitchen and the soft, bubbling sounds from the stove. His words, though harsh, no longer held the weight they once did. She had stopped allowing them to define her. "I'm here because I have a job to do," she said evenly, her voice steady. Edward's gaze sharpened. He didn't like the fact that she didn't flinch, that she wasn't bowing to him in fear. His eyes flicked down to the pot she was stirring, and then back to her, a smirk twisting his lips. "A job, yes. But the truth is, you're just a placeholder, aren't you? A temporary solution to a permanent problem." Marla froze for a moment, but she didn't let the comment rattle her. She had heard worse, and she was no longer the woman who would cower in response to his disdain. "I'm not here for you, Edward," she replied, her voice low but strong. "I'm here for them." She motioned toward the hallway where Sophie and Caleb were playing. For Sophie, for Caleb. They deserve more than the cold indifference you've given them. They deserve love. They deserve warmth. Edward's expression faltered for the briefest of seconds, but then it was gone, replaced by his usual sneer. "You think you can change them. You think you can fix what's been broken, he scoffed. You're nothing more than a distraction, Marla, a placeholder for a mother who was never meant to be. His words stung more than she cared to admit, but this time Marla didn't allow herself to be swayed. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, no fear in her eyes, just a quiet, unshakable certainty. I'm not trying to fix anything, Edward, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm trying to love them, and you can't take that away from me, no matter what you say, no matter what you do. For a moment, there was silence. Edward's eyes burned into hers, his arrogance, his pride, his fury all rolled into one powerful gaze. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Marla standing there, a quiet victor in the midst of the storm. As the days passed, she noticed something in Sophie's behavior, something small but significant. Sophie had started leaving her door slightly ajar at night, something she had never done before. It was as if she was beginning to accept the possibility of someone being there for her. And Caleb, in his own way, had become more vocal in his affection. He would tug at her hand, pulling her close, and would whisper, "I love you," when no one else was around. Those words, so simple and pure, were enough to keep Marla going. She knew that no matter how cruel Edward was, no matter how hard the fight would be, she was making a difference. She was giving them something that Edward could never provide. Unconditional love. One night, as Marla sat in the living room with Sophie and Caleb, a rare moment of peace settled over the house. The children were laughing softly at something Caleb had said, and Marla couldn't help but smile. This was the reason she was here. To be the foundation they needed, to be the mother they had been denied. But even in this quiet moment of contentment, Marla knew the storm was far from over. Edward was not the type to be bested easily, and she could feel the mounting tension in the air. His quiet anger was like a storm cloud on the horizon, ready to break. But Marla had made her choice. She would not allow Edward to destroy the love that had started to bloom in this house. She would stand her ground, no matter what. She would protect Sophie and Caleb, and in doing so, she would protect herself. Because this house, this broken family, was no longer just a job for her. It was her purpose. She would fight for them. She would fight for their future. And for the first time since she had walked through the doors of Blackwell Manor, she felt a spark of hope. It was small, but it was there. And that spark would be enough to light the way forward. That night, as she tucked Caleb into bed and kissed Sophie good night, Marla whispered to herself, "We will get through this. Together." And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. The quiet peace that settled over the mansion after that night was fleeting. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like things might be turning around. Marla found solace in Sophie's subtle steps toward trust and Caleb's unwavering need for her presence. They were small victories, yes, but they meant everything to her. It was as though, for the first time since her arrival, the walls around the children's hearts were beginning to crack. She held on to that, knowing how fragile those moments were, but also knowing that they were worth fighting for. Sophie still retreated often into her room, her withdrawn nature something Marla couldn't fully understand yet, but the occasional softening in the girl's demeanor, the tentative glances, the slightly longer conversations, gave Marla hope. Caleb, on the other hand, clung to her in a way that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. His need for her to be close to him, to comfort him, through the storm of uncertainty that loomed in this house, felt like both a blessing and a responsibility that weighed heavily on her. Marla's heart ached for Sophie, but she knew the girl's emotional walls were deeply entrenched in a life of constant disillusionment. Sophie, in many ways, had already learned the painful lesson that love and vulnerability could lead to abandonment. What Edward had taught her, more than anything, was that emotions were something to be hidden, something to be avoided if you wanted to survive. And yet, Marla refused to let Sophie's mistrust consume her completely. She made it a point to speak to her more, to make every effort to reassure her that no matter how dark it got, she wasn't alone. "I'm here for you," Marla would say, every time she caught Sophie's eye, even when the girl wouldn't meet her gaze. "You're not invisible." There was a coldness in Edward that Marla had never fully understood until now. His silence, his ability to look through people as if they were mere objects to be used and discarded, gnawed at her insides. But there were moments when his disdain took on a more dangerous form, like the time he had coldly dismissed a charity event Marla had organized for Sophie's school, claiming it was unimportant. The children's futures were unimportant to him. They were just pawns in the game he played with the world. It was in those moments that the full force of Edward's true character would emerge, his capacity for cruelty, his deep-rooted resentment of everything he couldn't control, especially the people closest to him. But the real shock came one night after dinner, when Edward, having had a particularly stressful day in his business dealings, came home drunk, something that hadn't happened often. But when it did, it was never without consequence. Marla had just finished putting Caleb to bed and was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Edward staggered into the room, his usual icy mask replaced by a haze of liquor. He looked at her with an intensity that, for a moment, seemed almost human. Vulnerable, raw, as though he had dropped his guard, and she could finally see the man beneath the facade. But even in this state, there was no empathy, no remorse in his eyes, just disdain, a quiet, simmering hatred. He stared at her for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak, then said in a low, slurred voice, "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? A saint in this God-forsaken house. You really believe you can fix what's broken?" Marla, who had been bracing herself for another of his cruel outbursts, stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The shift in his demeanor was unsettling. This was not the man she had known, the cold, calculating businessman who always maintained control. This was someone who had been worn down, broken by the very empire he had spent his life building. But she wasn't fooled. She knew better than to let her guard down around him. His words, though soaked in bitterness, were an attempt to provoke her. They were designed to make her question herself, to make her doubt her place in the world he had created. "No, Edward," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rising anger inside her. "I'm not here to fix you. I'm here for them, for Sophie and Caleb, because they deserve something better than the cold world you've created for them. They deserve love." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Love?" he mocked. "You really think they'll turn into what you want them to be? You think your kindness is going to make a difference in their lives? You're delusional." But Marla didn't flinch. She stood her ground, despite the sting of his words. "I'm not asking for you to understand, Edward. I'm not asking for your approval. But you're wrong about one thing. I'm not leaving. I'm here because I made a promise to them. And I'll keep that promise, even if it costs me everything." For a moment there was silence between them. The air seemed thick with unspoken tension, and Marla could feel the weight of Edward's gaze, his eyes burning through her. But just as quickly, it shifted, as though he had grown bored of the conversation, or maybe of her. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stumbled out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared into the shadows of the mansion. That night, Marla couldn't sleep. The interaction with Edward lingered in her mind, playing over and over again, like a broken record. She was shaken, but not in the way she expected. There was something in his words, in the way he had looked at her, that unsettled her. Was it possible that, despite everything, there was still a sliver of humanity in him, a part of him that was desperate for something more than the cold, detached life he had created? It was a thought that haunted her, one that she tried to push away as quickly as it came. But the reality was, as much as she tried to ignore it, the man she had come to know, the man who had hurt her, the man who had hurt his children, was someone she could never fully dismiss. He was part of their lives, for better or for worse, and she would have to learn how to navigate the minefield that was Edward Blackwell if she were ever to protect Sophie and Caleb from the damage he could do. The next day, after the usual coldness that had become their routine, Sophie came to her for the first time in what felt like forever. She had seen Edward's bitterness, the way his behavior was eroding what little was left of their family, and something inside her had snapped. She couldn't remain silent anymore. Sophie, who had long held her emotions inside, had started to realize that the pain they were all feeling didn't have to define them. It was as if, in the quiet of her heart, Sophie had decided that she could no longer let her father's cruelty dictate her life. She stepped toward Marla, holding out a drawing she had made of their family. Her, Caleb, and Marla, all together, smiling, a stark contrast to the way they were in reality. Marla looked at the drawing, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sadness. She knew that, despite all the pain, despite Edward's grip on their lives, there was still hope. There was still a chance for Sophie and Caleb to find their way out of this emotional darkness. And as she looked into Sophie's eyes, Marla realized that this was it. This was the moment where everything could change, because love, real love, had the power to heal. And she would make sure that the children knew that, no matter what it took. The quiet moments following Sophie's unexpected gesture were like a turning point, a crack in the carefully constructed walls of the Blackwell family. Sophie's drawing, a simple yet powerful depiction of the family she wished for, the one she longed to exist, was more than just art. It was a confession, a plea for love and connection, a silent declaration that despite the turmoil, she still held on to the hope that things could be different. Marla held that drawing in her hands as if it were a fragile treasure, feeling its weight, its significance. It felt like the culmination of everything she had been fighting for. Sophie was reaching out, testing the waters of trust, and for the first time, Marla felt a glimmer of genuine progress. But as much as Marla wanted to savor the moment, she knew this small victory was only the beginning. There were still so many obstacles in their path, and Edward's hold over the family remained as strong as ever. As the days went on, there was a subtle but noticeable shift in the household. Sophie, though still reserved, began to show moments of vulnerability. She started to participate more in conversations at the dinner table, her eyes less distant, her words less guarded. Caleb, too, seemed to be feeling the effects of the change. His laughter, once hesitant, became more frequent, his attachment to Marla deepening. He had begun to trust her as if she were his true mother. And while this growth was beautiful, it also came with a heavy burden. Marla knew that the more they started to open up to her, the more they would feel the sting of the emotional void left by Edward's neglect. Yet she couldn't stop herself from hoping that this gradual change would be enough to bring them back from the brink of emotional destruction. But the changes in the children didn't go unnoticed by Edward. His cold, calculating nature was never far from the surface, and he could sense that something was shifting in the dynamic of his family. He watched as Sophie became more withdrawn, though there were moments when she seemed to seek comfort from Marla, not him. It was a small, subtle rebellion, but it was enough to irk Edward, who believed he should be the center of their world. His treatment of Sophie had always been distant and indifferent, but he now began to feel that his control over her was slipping. And as for Caleb, the boy's attachment to Marla only fueled Edward's simmering resentment. Caleb's innocent need for affection had turned into something that Edward saw as a threat. In Edward's eyes, Marla was no longer just a nanny. She had become an obstacle, a reminder of what he could never provide for his children. The more they turned to her, the more it stoked the fire of his fury. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Edward approached Marla in the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the silence of the house. His presence was imposing, and the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. Marla, who had grown accustomed to the constant undercurrent of hostility that Edward exuded, didn't flinch when he spoke. "You're making a mistake," Edward said, his voice low, a dangerous edge to it. "You think you can change them? You think you can replace me in their lives? You're nothing but a temporary fix, Marla. Don't kid yourself." Marla met his gaze without hesitation, the weight of his words not having the effect they once would have. "I'm not trying to replace you, Edward. I'm trying to give them what they need. They need love, not control. They need a mother figure who will actually care, not someone who pushes them away." Edward's jaw clenched at her words. "You're treading dangerous ground, Marla. You think you know what's best for them, but you don't. You have no idea what's really going on here. This family isn't yours to fix." Her heart raced, but she refused to back down. "This family may not be mine to fix, but I'm not going anywhere. I won't watch you break them any further." There was a brief silence between them, a standoff, a silent battle of wills. Edward's eyes flashed with fury, but he said nothing more. Instead, he turned and stalked off down the hall, leaving Marla standing there, a mixture of relief and dread washing over her. She knew the confrontation wasn't over. This was only the beginning of what would be a long, painful struggle. In the days that followed, Marla's bond with Sophie and Caleb continued to grow, but so did Edward's animosity. He began to retaliate in subtle, cruel ways. He would cancel outings that Marla had planned for the children, leaving them disappointed and hurt. He would question her authority, undermining her in front of the staff, belittling her in front of others. He would even make cutting remarks about her background, reminding her that she was nothing more than an outsider who didn't belong in the world of the Blackwells. Each small act of cruelty felt like a strike against Marla's resolve, but she didn't back down. She had already made the decision that she wasn't going to let Edward's hatred win. She had come here to protect the children. And nothing was going to make her abandon them. One afternoon, after a particularly tense breakfast, where Edward had openly mocked Marla for the way she had handled a situation with Caleb, Sophie pulled Marla aside in the hallway. The girl looked pale, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't want to live like this anymore," Sophie confessed in a hushed voice, glancing nervously over her shoulder to make sure her father wasn't nearby. "I don't want to be in this house. I don't want to be with him." Marla felt a rush of emotion flood her chest as she looked at Sophie. This strong, beautiful girl who had been forced to carry the weight of her father's cruelty for so long. Sophie's words, her vulnerability, were a stark reminder of how much damage had already been done. And yet, it was also a reminder that Sophie had the strength to recognize the toxic environment she was living in. "We'll find a way out," Marla promised softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, Sophie. We'll get through this. I won't let him hurt you anymore." For the first time in weeks, Sophie gave her a small, tentative smile, the first genuine one Marla had seen in a long while. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that despite everything, despite Edward's manipulation and control, Sophie was beginning to see a path forward, a path where she didn't have to live in fear. But the weight of the promise Marla had made to Sophie pressed heavily on her heart. How could she protect them from someone so powerful, so ruthless as Edward? The answer came not through confrontation or anger, but through a quiet, persistent love. A love that didn't seek to change Edward, but to shield the children from his emotional neglect. It would be a slow, painful journey, but Marla had no intention of stopping. The next day, as the house was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps, Edward called for Marla. His voice, when it came, was surprisingly calm, almost unnervingly so. "Meet me in my office," he ordered. "Now." Marla's heart skipped a beat, but she made her way to his office, steeling herself for whatever confrontation awaited. As she stepped into the cold, sterile room, she found Edward seated at his desk, his gaze fixed on a pile of papers. He didn't look up when she entered, but his words hit her like a punch. "I know what you're doing, Marla," he said quietly. "I know you think you're some kind of savior. But you're not. You're just playing a part in a game you can't win." Marla took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You're wrong, Edward. I'm not trying to win anything. I'm just trying to help them." He finally looked up, his expression unreadable. But there was something dangerous in his eyes. A flicker of something Marla couldn't quite identify. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. "I can make your life here unbearable. Don't think I won't." And as she left the office, her resolve solidified even further. Edward might be powerful, but he had underestimated her. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following days after Edward's chilling warning weighed heavily on Marla's mind. She could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the Blackwell mansion closing in around her. The oppressive silence of the house seemed to amplify her every movement. Edward's subtle threats, his veiled promises of making her life unbearable, were like a shadow she couldn't escape. His cold words reverberated in her head. His eyes, those piercing, cold eyes, haunted her every time she passed him in the hallway. Yet deep down, despite the fear he instilled, Marla knew she couldn't back down. The stakes were too high. The children, Sophie and Caleb, were her responsibility now. She had made them a promise, and she would keep it. But the more she thought about his threat, the more she realized that Edward wasn't a man who would make idle threats. He had the power to destroy lives. He had already done it countless times before, and now it was her turn to face his wrath. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but her resolve hardened. She couldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him take the children's futures from them. Sophie and Caleb had begun to notice the change in their father's behavior. The tension in the house was palpable, and both children, though they tried to hide it, had started to retreat into themselves more and more. Caleb's usual bright smile had dimmed, and Sophie, who had already been distant, became even more withdrawn. Marla couldn't help but feel the weight of their silent distress pressing on her chest. She had to do something. She couldn't let them slip away into the darkness Edward had created around them. But how could she protect them when Edward had so much power, when he could make their lives miserable in an instant? One evening, after a particularly difficult dinner, where Edward had been his usual self, cold, dismissive, and condescending, Marla decided to speak to Sophie. The girl had barely touched her food, her eyes vacant, staring off into the distance. It was becoming all too familiar, and Marla could feel the crushing weight of the moment settling over her. She knew Sophie was close to breaking, close to letting the years of emotional neglect consume her. But Marla wasn't about to let that happen. She couldn't. "Sophie," Marla said softly, her voice breaking through the thick silence that enveloped them. "Can we talk?" Sophie hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. For a moment, Marla thought she might refuse, but then, slowly, the girl nodded and stood up from the table. Her shoulders slumped in resignation. She followed Marla into the living room, where the two of them sat on the plush velvet couch, the air thick with unspoken words. "I know, things are hard right now," Marla began, her heart aching as she watched Sophie's eyes flicker with a mix of pain and anger. "But you don't have to carry this burden alone. You have me. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, trying to hide her vulnerability. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He doesn't care about us. He never has. He never will." Marla's heart broke at the raw honesty in Sophie's voice. The girl was right. Edward had never truly cared about anyone but himself. And it wasn't just Sophie who was suffering. Caleb was hurting too. But the truth was, Marla wasn't sure how much longer she could protect them if things continued the way they were. The tension in the house was escalating, and Edward's behavior was becoming more erratic. His words had become sharper, his criticisms more cutting. His influence over his children was suffocating them. Marla couldn't stand by and watch them wither under his emotional tyranny. She had to find a way to break the cycle. "I know he's hurt you," Marla continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But you don't have to let his pain become yours. You are strong, Sophie, and you deserve to be happy. You deserve to feel safe, to feel loved. And I want you to know that I will always be here for you. I won't let him take that away from you." Sophie's face crumpled in anguish, and before Marla could react, the girl collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Marla held her tight, stroking her hair, her own tears welling up as she whispered soothing words. It was a rare moment of raw emotion, A moment where Sophie finally let herself feel everything she had been holding inside for so long. And in that moment, Marla realized that the fight for Sophie's heart was far from over. But it was worth it. Every tear, every quiet plea for help, every moment of vulnerability was a step toward healing, and Marla would not let Edward, or anyone, take that away from her. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Marla sat alone in the kitchen, staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse before they got better. Edward had been quiet since their conversation, but she knew that the calm was only temporary. It was only a matter of time before he came for her again, before he sought to reclaim control over everything in his life, including his children. But she couldn't let him win. Not this time. She had come too far, had fought too hard for Sophie and Caleb to let him destroy them now. As Marla sat there, stewing in the quiet unease that seemed to linger in the house like a storm cloud, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Edward standing in the doorway, his presence commanding, his gaze intense. It was the first time in days that he had sought her out, and the look in his eyes wasn't one of the cold indifference she had come to expect. No, this time there was something else there, something darker, more calculating. "Marla," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat, but she steeled herself. She had faced him before, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't going to back down. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady despite the unease building inside her. Edward stepped into the room, his gaze unwavering. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "You think you can save them, don't you?" he asked, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "You think you can fix what's broken in this family. But you're wrong. They'll never be what you want them to be. They'll never be what you need them to be." Marla's heart clenched at his words, but she refused to let him see the impact they had on her. "I'm not trying to change them," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I'm just trying to give them a chance to be happy, a chance to heal." Edward's expression hardened, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're playing with fire, Marla. You don't understand what you're up against." Marla took a deep breath, standing her ground. "I understand more than you think, Edward. I understand that love isn't something you can control. And I understand that I'm not afraid of you anymore." The silence that followed was thick with tension, as though the entire house was holding its breath, and in that moment Marla knew that the battle between them wasn't just about the children anymore. It was about power, control, and who would ultimately win the war for their hearts. Edward's lips twisted into a smirk. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice filled with menace. As he turned and left the room, Marla felt a surge of determination course through her. She wasn't going to lose. Not this time. Not while Sophie and Caleb needed her. The battle was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She was done running. She was done being afraid. The Blackwells might have the wealth, but she had something far more powerful. Love, and that she would use to fight for the children who deserved so much more than the cold, suffocating world Edward had created for them. The following morning, after Edward's cryptic and threatening words, the house felt eerily quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath, anticipating the storm that was bound to come. Marla couldn't shake the weight of their exchange, the harshness in his voice still echoing in her mind. Despite his attempts to undermine her, she stood resolute. But the truth was, the stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about protecting Sophie and Caleb anymore. It was about holding on to her own sense of power, her own will to fight back against someone who had long ruled his household with an iron fist. Every move, every conversation, every glance from Edward felt like a silent battle being waged, and the tension that lingered in the house was almost suffocating. Yet Marla's resolve did not waver. She had already been through too much to turn back now. As she went about her day, tending to the children's needs, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in Sophie's demeanor. The girl, though still quiet and withdrawn, had become more open to Marla, her small gestures of trust more apparent. She had stopped retreating into her shell as much, though the scars of the past still lingered in her eyes. Caleb, too, was seeking comfort from Marla in ways he never had before. He would seek her out during the quiet moments, his small hand slipping into hers as they walked together through the halls of the mansion. It was clear that the children were growing attached to her, and with each passing day, their dependence on her love and stability seemed to increase. This attachment, however, wasn't without its dangers. Edward had already begun to notice the closeness between Marla and his children, and with that awareness came a simmering jealousy. Edward wasn't accustomed to feeling threatened, especially not by someone like Marla. She was nothing more than a servant in his eyes, a position he believed should hold no power. But she had already proven herself to be more than just a caretaker. She was becoming their lifeline. It was during one of these quiet moments when Sophie came to her, looking tentative but determined. She approached Marla slowly, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and something else, a flicker of hope, perhaps. "Marla, can I talk to you?" Sophie's voice was soft but urgent, as if every word she spoke carried a weight that threatened to crush her. Marla, sensing the girl's need for comfort, smiled reassuringly and guided her to the cozy nook by the fireplace, a spot where they had often shared quiet conversations. The warmth from the fire crackled softly in the background, but the chill between them was palpable. Sophie hesitated for a moment before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can live like this anymore," Sophie confessed, her words tumbling out like a dam that had finally broken. "I don't want to be here. I want to leave. I want to be somewhere safe." Marla's heart clenched, but she held her composure. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when Sophie's fragile resolve might shatter completely. Yet it was also the moment she had prepared for, because it was the truth that Sophie had needed to say for so long. Marla took a deep breath, reaching for the girl's trembling hand. "I understand, Sophie," Marla said softly, her voice full of compassion. "But you're not alone in this. You don't have to stay here and suffer. You're stronger than you think, and I'm here with you. We'll figure this out together." Sophie's face crumpled, and she buried her face in Marla's shoulder, letting her tears fall freely. For the first time in what seemed like ages, Sophie allowed herself to break down, to release the flood of emotions that had been choking her. And Marla, holding the girl close, felt the weight of those emotions pressing against her own heart. It was as if all the pain Sophie had been carrying for so long had come to a head in that single moment of vulnerability. and Marla couldn't let her carry that burden alone. She held her tighter, whispering words of comfort, her own eyes filling with tears as she realized just how much these children had already endured. But the conversation was far from over. When Sophie finally pulled back, her face tear-streaked but more composed, she looked Marla in the eye. "I don't want to be afraid any more, Marla," Sophie said, her voice trembling but filled with an unexpected strength. "I don't want to be afraid of him." Marla could feel the sincerity in Sophie's words, the deep-seated desire for freedom, for escape from the suffocating control Edward had exerted on them for so long. It was a sentiment that Marla had long shared, and it made her heart ache knowing that the girl felt as trapped as she did. The difference was, Sophie was still so young, still so vulnerable, and it was Marla's job to protect her, to protect both of them. "I promise you, Sophie," Marla said, her voice firm but full of compassion. "I won't let him hurt you anymore. We'll find a way out, together, no matter what it takes." But as Marla spoke those words, a feeling of foreboding settled in her gut. Edward's presence was everywhere. She could almost feel his eyes on her, even when he wasn't in the room. The power he held over his household was suffocating, and she realized that in order to free Sophie and Caleb, they would have to do something far more drastic than they had ever anticipated. The next few days felt like a tense prelude to a battle that Marla was no longer sure she was ready for. Edward had become more unpredictable, his moods shifting from cold indifference to explosive anger, all directed at Marla. His behavior toward the children had also become more volatile. Sophie, especially, was on edge, knowing that her father was growing more aware of her growing attachment to Marla. She had begun to retreat even further into herself, afraid of inciting his wrath. Caleb, too, began to withdraw, sensing the tension in the house. Marla could see it all, the fear in their eyes, the way they flinched whenever Edward's footsteps echoed through the hallways. It was becoming harder for them to feel safe in their own home. And that was when Marla realized that the only way out for them was to confront Edward head-on. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Marla found herself standing alone in the grand hallway, her mind racing with thoughts of the future. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that made the walls feel oppressive. She knew that this couldn't continue. She couldn't allow Edward to destroy everything she had fought for: the children, their safety, their happiness. It was time to take action. But just as Marla steeled herself to confront the beast that Edward had become, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find him standing there in the hallway, his face twisted in that all-too-familiar sneer. "I know what you're doing, Marla," Edward said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can make them believe in fairy tales, but you're wrong. I own them. They belong to me." Marla met his gaze without flinching. "You don't own them, Edward. They're human beings, not possessions, and I'm going to make sure they know that." Edward took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can break me," he scoffed. "You're nothing. You're just a nanny, a pawn in a game you'll never win." Marla's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood tall. She had come too far to back down now. "You may have power, Edward, but you don't have love, and that's something you'll never understand." The silence that followed was thick with tension, but for the first time, Marla didn't feel afraid. She had fought for her place in this world, and she wasn't about to let him take it away from her. The battle for Sophie and Caleb's hearts was only just beginning, and she was ready to fight, no matter the cost. As Edward turned and walked away, a sense of quiet determination settled over Marla. She knew the road ahead would be long, and she knew that the stakes were higher than ever. But in that moment, she made a silent vow to herself and to the children. She would fight for them, for their freedom, for their futures, no matter the cost. And she would never stop fighting. The silence in the Blackwell mansion had become almost unbearable, thick with tension and unspoken words. Marla had never felt the weight of the house more than she did now. It was as though the very walls were closing in on her. She had made a promise to Sophie and Caleb. She had vowed to protect them from the emotional devastation that Edward, in his cruelty, had inflicted on them. But now, after their confrontation, she realized that the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about defending them from their father's wrath anymore. It was about keeping their spirits intact, protecting their hearts, and ensuring that they didn't lose the very essence of who they were in the face of so much darkness. The night after their exchange in the hallway, Marla couldn't shake the feeling that something in the air had shifted. Edward's threats weren't just empty words anymore. They were a promise, a looming danger that hung over them all. She had no illusions about the depth of his cruelty. It wasn't just his coldness, it was the way he could manipulate, twist situations, and turn people into pawns in his own personal game. Marla could see it clearly now. He was no longer just a man consumed by his own bitterness and racism. He was a predator, and his prey was his own family. And Marla? She was in his sights now, as much as Sophie and Caleb were. But she couldn't afford to be afraid. Fear would only paralyze her. If she let it in, she'd lose everything she was fighting for. And so, the next day, as the morning sun filtered through the large windows of the mansion, Marla made her way to Sophie and Caleb's rooms with a new sense of resolve. They needed her now, more than ever. She couldn't protect them from the outside world, but she could give them a safe space here, in this house that had become a prison for them. As she stepped into Sophie's room, she found the girl sitting by the window, staring out into the vast manicured gardens. Her posture was slumped, her face etched with worry. It was as if she was waiting for something to change, but she didn't know what. Marla sat beside her and gently touched her arm, a small, reassuring gesture. Sophie turned her head, her eyes wide and vulnerable, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world had narrowed down to this one fragile moment. "Sophie," Marla said softly, her voice full of warmth, "we'll get through this. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. You and Caleb, you deserve better than this. We'll figure it out, I promise." Sophie looked at her with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I know, Marla. I know you'll protect us. But I feel like we're running out of time. Daddy is getting worse. I can feel it." Marla nodded, her heart aching for the girl's vulnerability. Sophie's instincts were sharp. She could sense the changes in her father long before Marla had started to notice the true extent of his cruelty. But Marla wouldn't let that stop her. She couldn't. "I know it feels like time is slipping away, but we'll take it one step at a time," Marla said, her voice firm with conviction. "We're in this together. We'll find a way out. I won't let him hurt you any more. I swear it." Sophie seemed to take comfort in Marla's words, the tiniest spark of hope igniting in her eyes. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to remind Marla why she was fighting. For every tear Sophie had shed, for every ounce of pain Caleb had endured, she would stand between them and Edward. No matter what. Later that day, as Marla prepared the children for dinner, she overheard a conversation between Edward and one of his associates. His voice, cold and cutting, carried through the open door. He was discussing business, but his tone was darker than usual, the edge of cruelty sharper. It wasn't just about controlling his empire anymore. It was about control over everything in his life, even his children. As she eavesdropped from the hallway, she caught fragments of their conversation. "Marla's getting too comfortable," Edward's voice hissed. "She thinks she can just walk in here and become part of this family. She's delusional if she thinks I'll let that happen. This is my house. I run things here." His words were like daggers to Marla's heart. He was right, in a way. She wasn't part of his family. She never would be, at least not in his eyes. But she didn't need to be. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his permission to love Sophie and Caleb. They had become her family in ways Edward would never understand. As the conversation continued, Marla's mind raced. She had known Edward was ruthless, but hearing his venomous words made it clear just how far he was willing to go to destroy her. His threats were no longer subtle. They were direct, and the weight of them pressed heavily on her chest. He wouldn't stop until she was out of the picture. He wouldn't stop until he had control over everything. She knew she couldn't allow that to happen. Not anymore. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Marla found herself alone in the grand kitchen, the house eerily silent around her. The threat Edward had issued earlier hung in the air like a storm, waiting to break. The kitchen, with its polished counters and gleaming utensils, felt foreign to her now. She wasn't just a servant here. She was a protector, a fighter. And this place, which had once seemed so comforting, was now a battleground. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and there he was. Edward. His presence was like a dark cloud, overshadowing everything in the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them palpable. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowed, and Marla felt the weight of his gaze. "You think you're in control, don't you?" Edward said, his voice low, filled with disdain. "You think you can just waltz in here and take my children from me? I won't let you destroy everything I've built, Marla. I'll make sure of it." Marla stood her ground, her heart racing but her voice steady. "I'm not here to destroy anything, Edward. I'm here to protect them. I'm here to protect Sophie and Caleb from you. You've already done enough damage. But I won't let you tear them apart any more than you already have." Edward's lips curled into a smirk, though there was no humor in it. "You think you can fight me? You're just a nanny. You have no power here, and when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never stepped foot into this house." His words were venomous, meant to hurt, meant to break her. But they didn't. They couldn't. "I don't need your approval, Edward," Marla said, her voice rising with a confidence she didn't even know she had. "I don't need your permission to care for these children. You've spent your whole life building walls around yourself. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. Not after everything I've seen." For a moment there was a flash of something in Edward's eyes. Anger, yes, but also something deeper. something darker. His jaw clenched, and he stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You'll regret this." But Marla, despite the fear that threatened to creep up her spine, stood firm. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As Edward turned and stormed out of the kitchen, Marla felt a mixture of anger and relief surge through her. She had finally stood up to him. She had finally confronted him with the truth. And though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let him tear apart the family she had come to love. She had made a promise to Sophie and Caleb, and no matter what Edward threw her way, she would keep it. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Marla felt like she was fighting on her terms. The night after their confrontation felt surreal. Marla's heart was still pounding from the intensity of the exchange, but beneath the fierce anger she'd felt when facing Edward, there was also a deep sense of relief. For the first time, she had stood up to him. Really stood up to him. And for the first time, she had seen a crack in his armor. His threats, though harsh and cutting, had been the words of a man who was no longer in control, who was losing his grip on everything he thought he owned. Marla knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Edward had been living in a bubble of unchecked power for so long that the reality of losing it was beginning to set in. But she wasn't naive enough to think he would back down easily. If anything, his anger would only grow, and with it, his desire to break her down. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at her insides, Marla couldn't help but feel stronger than she ever had before. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her power, and no matter what came next, she would not let him destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Sophie and Caleb were quieter than usual, both of them sensing the undercurrents of danger that had swept through their home like a storm. As much as Marla wanted to protect them from it, she knew there was no escaping the reality of the situation. Edward was unpredictable, dangerous, and capable of unimaginable cruelty. His behavior had become even more erratic in the days that followed, his moods shifting with the breeze, and every time he looked at Marla, she could feel the weight of his contempt. His threats were not idle. He was determined to make her life as miserable as possible, to force her out of the house, out of their lives. But what Edward didn't understand was that Marla wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid to lose everything she had built for the children. She wasn't afraid to fight back. As she stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the children, the doorbell rang. A familiar voice called out from the hallway, and Marla's heart skipped a beat. It was Angela, one of Edward's oldest friends, a woman who had always been cordial but never warm to Marla. Angela's presence at the door was unexpected, and Marla immediately felt a sense of foreboding. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer the door, her mind racing with possibilities. What did Angela want? Why was she here? And why today of all days? When Marla opened the door, Angela stood there, with a tense smile on her face. She was impeccably dressed, as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her makeup flawless. But there was something in her eyes, a certain wariness that made Marla's stomach twist. "Marla," Angela said coolly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Marla's eyes narrowed, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. Angela had never come to the house uninvited before, and she had certainly never sought her out for a private conversation. "What's going on?" Marla asked, her voice steady despite the unease settling in her chest. Angela glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was nearby before she spoke, her voice lowered to a whisper. "It's about Edward. He's losing it, Marla. I don't know if you've noticed, but he's unraveling, and it's getting worse by the day. I don't know how much longer he can keep up the act." Marla's heart beat faster, her mind racing. She had known that Edward's behavior had become more unpredictable, but hearing it confirmed by someone on the inside sent a chill down her spine. "What do you mean, unraveling?" Marla asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though the urgency in her tone betrayed her. "He's been acting like a madman lately. But what are you really saying, Angela?" Angela sighed, casting a quick glance at the hallway before speaking again. "Edward has been getting worse, Marla. He's paranoid. He's isolating himself more and more, and he's pushing everyone away, even the people who've supported him all these years. He's convinced that someone is plotting against him. And I don't know if you've seen it, but his obsession with you, your relationship with the children, is driving him to do things I've never seen before. He's dangerous, Marla. He's a ticking time bomb." Marla's mind spun. She had always known Edward to be ruthless, but she hadn't realized just how deeply his paranoia had begun to consume him. This wasn't just about controlling his family. This was about his own unraveling psyche. And as much as she hated to admit it, that made him even more dangerous than before. "He's going to try to do something. I'm sure of it," Angela said, her voice trembling slightly now. "You need to be careful. He doesn't take kindly to being defied, and you've already made an enemy of him. But he's not just angry with you. He's angry with everyone. And when he gets like this, I'm afraid he'll do anything to protect his pride. He'll burn everything down just to keep the illusion of control." Marla swallowed hard, the weight of Angela's words sinking in. She could feel the heaviness of the situation pressing against her chest, her heart beating faster with every passing second. She knew Edward wasn't the type to back down, but hearing Angela's warning made the reality of their situation all the more terrifying. "What can I do?" Marla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I stop him?" Angela's gaze softened for a moment, but it was clear she was as scared as Marla was. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "But you need to get out. Leave this house. Take Sophie and Caleb and go somewhere safe. I'm telling you, it's only going to get worse. If you stay here, you're walking into a trap. Edward has already started making plans to get rid of you. You won't win if you try to fight him head-on. He's too powerful." Marla felt her world tilt. She had always known that Edward was dangerous, but hearing this from someone who had been close to him for so long was a wake-up call. Angela's words were full of fear, and Marla knew she wasn't exaggerating. But leaving the house, leaving the children she had promised to protect, felt like an impossible decision. She couldn't just run away. She couldn't leave them behind. "I can't just leave, Angela," Marla said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't abandon them. They need me." Angela placed a hand on Marla's arm, her grip tight with urgency. "I know you want to help them, Marla. I know you love them. But sometimes the best way to protect people is to get them out of harm's way. You need to think carefully. Edward is dangerous, and if you don't act quickly, it could be too late." Marla felt the weight of Angela's words settle over her, and for the first time she realized that she might be fighting a battle she couldn't win on her own. She couldn't take down Edward by force. She couldn't beat him at his own game. But she had one advantage: love. She loved Sophie and Caleb, and for their sake, she would do whatever it took. "I'll protect them," Marla said, her voice filled with determination. "But I won't run. Not yet. There has to be another way." Angela gave her a look that was a mixture of pity and concern. "I hope you're right, Marla, but just know that time is running out." As Angela left the house, Marla stood in the doorway, her mind racing. She had to find a way to protect the children and herself from Edward's increasingly erratic behavior. The house, once a home, had become a ticking time bomb, and the clock was winding down. Marla knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to back down. No matter what it took, she would fight for them, and she would fight to the end. The days following Angela's warning felt like a blur. Every moment that passed, Marla could feel the weight of Edward's presence closing in on her, even though he hadn't made a direct move. Yet, she had always known that Edward's power came not just from his wealth, but from his ability to manipulate every situation, to control everything and everyone around him. But now, it was different. Now, he was cornered. His control was slipping, his paranoia becoming more pronounced, and Marla could see the cracks widening. But there was something else. Something in her gut that told her Edward's obsession with her and his children wasn't just about losing power. It was personal. It always had been. And as she woke up each day, looking into Sophie and Caleb's innocent eyes, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was all leading toward a reckoning. Marla didn't have much time left. She knew it. Angela's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder that the clock was ticking, but she refused to let fear dominate her decisions. Every morning she rose with a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't run. Not from Edward, not from her responsibilities to Sophie and Caleb. They were everything to her now. As the sun began to set on yet another tense day, Marla found herself standing by the window of the nursery, watching the golden light fade into darkness. The children were with her, sitting quietly on the floor, playing, lost in their own little world. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that constantly churned beneath the surface of their lives. The silence in the room felt both comforting and suffocating. It was as though they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to break the calm. Edward hadn't appeared that day, but Marla could feel his shadow over them all. She had seen the way his eyes followed her whenever they crossed paths in the house, the cold, calculating look he gave her, as if he were waiting for her to slip up. She knew he was watching, plotting his next move. She had to be ready. But ready for what? She didn't know. She just knew that whatever was coming, it was going to change everything. Later that evening, when the children had gone to bed, Marla found herself in the living room, sitting alone in the quiet of the house. The mansion, which had once felt like a luxurious refuge, now seemed like a gilded cage. She could hear the faint hum of the wind outside, the rustling of the trees in the distance. The sounds of the night seemed so far removed from the tension that gripped her heart. But the stillness was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned, expecting to see a servant, or perhaps one of the other staff members, But instead, there stood Edward, his face pale and drawn, his expression grim. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the silence between them more oppressive than any words could be. Edward's gaze was fixed on her, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line. Marla stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced him many times before, but this was different. There was a finality to his presence now, something in the air that told her this was it. "I've been thinking," Edward finally said, his voice low and steady, though there was an edge to it that made her blood run cold. "You're making a mistake, Marla. You think you can change things. You think you can save them, but you can't. They're mine. They always will be. You'll never be a part of this family, no matter what you do." Marla swallowed, the anger and hurt rising in her throat. "I'm not here to be part of your family, Edward. I'm here to protect them. Sophie, Caleb, they're not your possessions. They're people, and I'm not going to let you tear them apart anymore." Edward took a step forward, his eyes narrowing, the sneer on his lips deepening. "You think you're the hero here, don't you? That you can come in and make everything better. But you're wrong. You can't change anything. You're nothing more than a pawn in this game. And soon you'll realize that you've been playing by my rules all along." Marla's heart thudded in her chest, but she refused to show him fear. She was no pawn. She had spent too long living in fear of him, letting him control the narrative, letting him push her around. Not anymore. "I'm not afraid of you, Edward," Marla said, her voice unwavering. "You may think you control everything, but you're wrong. You don't control love. You don't control what I'm willing to fight for. I've fought for them since the moment I stepped foot in this house, and I'll continue to fight until the very end." Edward's eyes flashed with something darker now, something almost desperate. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice dropped to a whisper, dangerous and low. "I've lost everything, and if I can't have them, if I can't have control, then no one will." Before Marla could react, Edward moved toward her, his hands reaching for her, as if he intended to grab her by the shoulders. But just as quickly, there was a knock at the door. Both of them froze. The sound echoed through the tense air like a lifeline, something that broke the spell of the moment. Marla stepped back, her breath ragged, but she was resolute. She wasn't going to let him take everything from her now. She wasn't going to let him take Sophie and Caleb. Edward's expression faltered for the briefest of moments before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the hallway. Marla stood still, her mind racing. What was going on? What had just happened? And who was at the door? She hurried to open it, and standing there was Angela, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. "Marla, you have to go," Angela said urgently, her voice trembling. "It's worse than I thought. Edward's completely lost it. He's been making plans to move them out of the country. He's going to take them from you." Marla's blood ran cold. "What?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's making arrangements for tomorrow. You have to act fast. They're going to be gone before you even know it." Panic surged through Marla's chest, but she didn't have time to waste. "Where are they? Sophie? Caleb?" "I don't know. He's got them in his study, but it's only a matter of time before he moves them out. Please, Marla, you have to go now." Without another word, Marla turned and ran toward the stairs, her heart pounding as she raced toward the study. When she burst through the door, she found Edward standing by the window, staring out into the night. Sophie and Caleb were nowhere in sight. Her heart clenched in her chest. "Where are they?" Marla demanded, her voice hoarse with fear. Edward turned slowly, his gaze cold and calculated. "You'll never get them. They're already mine. There's nothing you can do to stop me." But Marla wasn't going to back down. She took a deep breath, her voice steady. "You're wrong, Edward. You can't control them. You can't control love. You can't control what I'm willing to fight for." For a long moment, there was only silence. And then the door behind Edward creaked open, and Sophie and Caleb appeared, looking confused but safe. Edward stared at them, a flicker of something almost like regret flashing in his eyes. But it was fleeting. "This isn't over, Marla," he said, his voice low, a dangerous promise. But Marla didn't let his words faze her. She turned to Sophie and Caleb, her arms opening wide as they rushed into her embrace. They were safe, and as long as she had breath in her body, she would make sure they always would be. It was over. Edward had lost. The children were hers now, and they would never be apart again. With a steady heart and a determined will, Marla walked out of the study, the weight of the battle behind her, and the future ahead of her clear for the first time in years. She was no longer just a nanny. She was their protector, their mother, and together they would face whatever the world had to throw at them. And in that moment, for the first time in a long while, Marla finally felt free.